Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to We're Better Together, attracting large numbers of donors, volunteers, and subscribers. We are happy to have you joining us and appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us here today. My name's Kimberly. I'm part of the QGive team. If you haven't had the opportunity to work with us before, we're an online fundraising platform dedicated to helping nonprofits like yours raise more money. And part of how we do that is through webinars like this one. So today's webinar will be about 45 minutes with a Q&A session to follow, keeping our time about an hour or so. We are recording the presentation and sending to each of you a follow-up email that will have a link to the recording, a copy of the presentation, as well as links to the resources we discussed today. So please be on the lookout for an email from us tomorrow. We are also live tweeting today's webinar highlights at the hashtag QGiveWebinar. So if you are a Twitter user, please follow us and join in on the discussion. Our username is QGive. If you do have questions at any point today during the presentation, please go ahead and pop those into the questions box. Ellen, our presenter here, is ready to answer and discuss those during our Q&A portion that follows the presentation. And just a reminder that at the end of today's webinar, there is a survey. We would really encourage your feedback because it's crucial in how we determine future content for webinars and other resources that we produce throughout the year. So we are very proud of the relationships that we have here and happy to be working with Bristol Strategy. Before diving into today's presentation, just wanted to take a quick peek at QGive's background, mission, offering. So if you're not familiar, you know a bit about us. We've been helping nonprofits implement and grow their online fundraising programs since 2007. And as the importance of online giving has grown, our mission has remained the same, which is to help others fulfill their passion to make a difference. And we do that with a comprehensive suite of fundraising tools featuring donation forms, event registration, peer-to-peer fundraising, text giving, outbound messaging, auction events, just the gamut. And we are excited to introduce you to Bristol Strategy Group, who help mid-sized nonprofits improve and strengthen their fundraising and financial strategies. So we are joined today by Ellen Bristol, the founder of Bristol Strategy Group. And as you're going to hear, Ellen has a diverse background in fundraising performance management. So over to you, Ellen.
Oh, to introduce myself?
Yes, to take over the screen and introduce yourself.
I can do that. Yeah, I do have a diverse background and an unusual one for a fundraising consultant because I spent the first 20 years of my career in high-end corporate sales where I was a major account rep. And back in '95, I opened my own consulting practice and fell madly in love with the nonprofit sector, rapidly discovering that some of the disciplines we take for granted in the world of corporate sales were distinctly lacking, underappreciated, or unknown in fundraising. So we have made it our mission since the day we opened to create more powerful methods to get productivity out of our fundraising efforts, to plug the leaks where we're losing time or effort or money or disengaging donors inadvertently. We have a couple of trademarked solutions. One is our methodology, Fundraising the Smart Way, and the other is our quite well-known leaky bucket assessment for effective fundraising. And I'm happy to say that QGive and Bristol are collaborating on Leaky Bucket version 2.0, which will launch in the first quarter of 2022. We won't talk about my personal background. Been there, done that. So I'm also a member and on the governing board of the Association of Philanthropic Counsel. I'm with Association of Fundraising Professionals, N10, and the advancement services professionals. So shall we launch?
Please do. I'm hoping everyone can see your screen. It's your show, Ellen.
You want to start with the QGIV rundown?
Well, we're actually on your Better
Okay.
Together. So,
so let's go there. Let's do that. All right. Today's program, as you already know, is We're Better Together. Now, is this your screen share or mine?
That's mine. If you want to go ahead
I
and
gotta
take
fix
it.
this and do mine. Okay, everybody. Nothing like a little humanity injected into everything. All righty. I'll tell you why I wanted to work on this webinar with my friends at QGIV. And we're going to talk about it in a little more detail, but what I've seen over the last few years is a creeping tendency to violate the famous Pareto rule. The Pareto rule is a statistical term that says 80% of your whatever provides 20% of your results, while 20% of your whatever provides 80% of your results. So historically, that would tell us 20% of our donors are providing 80% of our income. But unfortunately, that ratio has been tending closer to 10%, providing 90% of our income. And a lot of us in the consulting field, the analysts and strategists about fundraising performance are getting pretty anxious about that problem. And I'm going to explain what's at stake and how to fix the problem before we all become part of Amazon. Hold on. Okay. So I want to talk about the concept of the donor versus the marcher. I talked about this anecdote in a blog I wrote for QGIV recently. I was sitting with the ED and board chair of an advocacy organization, and the ED, who was new to the job, was very eager to launch a major donor acquisition campaign. Whereupon, and usually board members love that. Oh boy, howdy, we'll get lots of big chunks of money fast. This board chair was swift enough to say, hold on a second. We don't just want donors, we want marchers. So I said, what's the difference? And she said, we need people who are on the ground, people who aren't part of the 1%, people who will give small gifts regularly, who will turn out, who will volunteer, who will participate in our walkathons, ride-a-thons, bike-a-thons, what-a-thons, and will literally march for our cause. That has always stuck with me, and that's what I want to talk about. How do we get those marchers? So bear with me, folks, because I'm going to be using the term marchers a lot during this conversation, because I can't make my mouth wrap around transactional giving and annual fund and all that other jazz. So the difference between major funders and marchers is that major funders, and by this I'm including grant makers and corporate sponsors, as well as individuals who make big, fat, gigantic gifts of 6 and 7 figures. They make big investments, and there are a few of them. Marchers, on the other hand, are ordinary people like us guys. There are lots of them. They make smaller investments, but they make lots of smaller investments. And they often make those investments month after month and year after year. They often tend to have as much passion, if not more, and time and energy and a desire to volunteer They may not have a lot of money, but they might make gifts in kind or gifts of their time. And they will literally turn out, should you decide to have a rally or a march for your cause. So here's some troubling news about losing the marchers. Gee, something funny happened with this deck. I'm trusting everybody to be able to read it. So, every year Giving USA puts out a report on on giving in the US. And in spite of the upheavals and dislocations of the year 2020, in spite of everything, the US is a philanthropic nation. So overall giving went up to its highest level ever, somewhere around $471 billion, which was up 5% from the previous so-called normal year of 2019. Yay, isn't that great? The bad news is significantly fewer households give to charity. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this statistic down the road, but it comes from a very interesting study performed biannually or triannually from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. So what we saw in this new report was a significant uptick in giving from a few uber wealthy people, the 1%. To which I say, Mazel Tov, I'm very glad more wealthy people are giving more large gifts. But there are some troubling outcomes associated with those large gifts. For one thing, there's also a rise in giving to foundations and donor advised funds. So a lot of the money is going to intermediaries, and there's actually less going direct to your nonprofit and your nonprofit and your nonprofit. We got to do better than that. So why is this a problem? Well, it certainly is a problem. In fact, it's three problems. When a huge proportion of your income comes from few major funders, there are three areas where your nonprofit is at risk. You all know about the financial vulnerability. So if you're funded primarily by the government, or you're funded primarily by one or two grants, they're in control of the money, and you never know when you're going to wake up one day to a voicemail message saying, oh, by the way, we reallocated all our funding and we're ripping away 47% of your income. So that's not a good thing. But there's also the question of undue influence. It's very difficult to resist the desire and the proclivity to want to keep those few major donors happy. And that might mean, consciously or unconsciously, you and your major funders get into a little dance that sort of pulls you unawares a little bit away from the direction you really want to take in order to retain the largesse of those few major donors. And this is something I work on a lot with our clients, because the question should not be, well, we're going to talk about this too in a second. The donor cannot dictate your mission and the route you take to achieve it. They can only support it or give advice that you're entitled not to accept. The third problem of having a lot of income concentrated in a few hands is that your organization loses resiliency and nimbleness. You don't hear the voices and see the concerns of representatives of your purpose, the clients you serve, who could and should be supporting you in some way, even though their means might be modest or non-existent. So how do we solve that problem? Well, let's do a deeper dive into each of these risk areas. And the first thing to talk about is the question of who owns your nonprofit. Now, in my case, I run a small business. I own it. And I'm responsible for all of my own boneheaded mistakes, right? But I kind of feel like I don't own it. My clients own it. If I can't do things for my clients, and members of my team don't support them properly, something's wrong. So in the major donor field, we tend to lose the distinction between who owns the nonprofit and who funds the nonprofit. All nonprofit organizations have no individual owner. They're owners, to use the term owner as a metaphor here, the people who own your organization are the community you serve. Your governing board, in strictest terms, should represent their interests. Your client base includes the community you serve. And all of your funders really need to be acquired and retained based on their connection and commitment to your mission, your cause, and the programs you offer, not because somebody's a friend. Undue influence also includes what I call the cynics' golden rule. Some of you may have heard this from your grandparents. Then what has the gold makes the rules. You know what I mean, guys? So this is the dark side of being overly donor-centric. It moves us away from doing what we know or believe to be right and keep striving to do right based on feedback from our clients. It can also drive mission drift. I'll give you a classic example. An early client of ours accepted a large gift and from an organization, but the gift required that they build a dental clinic into their operation. Their operation trained women and men who were in poverty and unemployed to learn how to compete for jobs. Excuse me, a dental clinic? Hello, this is called mission drift. Guess what? They struggled and struggled to make that dental clinic work, and it was always a flop. As I said, there's conscious and unconscious, unintended impact. Major funders tend to get more attention from everybody on the team. Major funders often get invited to serve on boards. That to me sort of smacks of buying a board seat. And I think it's a little bit ethically questionable. And then there's the follow the leader concept. If one major funder wants to have that much influence, somebody else is likely to come along. Now let's talk, listen guys, please keep asking questions about and make as specific as you want and send them to Kim on the Q&A button. So now let's talk about the risks of financial vulnerability. What if a major funder stops funding, or they die and they didn't leave all their money to you? The real problem is that if you have more than a certain amount of total income tied up in a single funding source. Recovering from major losses is tough, if not impossible. We had an organization down here in South Florida that provided children and services for children and families. And they had become a kind of clearinghouse for millions of dollars from the state, which they then doled out to the local centers that provided child and family services like voluntary pre-K. And all of a sudden, one fine day, they called the CEO and said, we're reducing your state funding from $200 million to $20 million. You're going to have to lay off 250 employees. Please have this done by a week from Thursday. It was a horror show. They did eventually manage to recover. And you're probably all sitting there thinking $200 million, $20 million, we're then not in that category, but just imagine. Now, in corporate sales, between you and me and the gatepost folks, I think there's a lot to learn from corporate sales organizations. Not everything, but here's one of the things that really applies, and I think it's so valuable for our conversation today. And that is the concept of customer concentration. I've read you can look this up on Google. I've read any number of articles about it, but basically what they all say is no single customer should account for more than 9 to 12% of total revenues, because then you're out of balance. And no single group of customers may account for more than 25% of total revenues. So let's translate that to nonprofit lingo. No single funder or group of funders should account for more than a nonprofit can afford to lose. And you choose the limits you can tolerate. If today 50% of your money comes from one grant, strive next year to raise income levels from other sources so that grant represents 35% of total income. In other words, bring on the marchers. Now let's talk about resilience. See undue influence. If you ever hear anybody say, gee, if we do that, funder X might not approve of it, wrong. You guys are in charge. You have to take the lead. You have to make your own decisions. In other venues, I often talk about whether or not your funders are right for you. Are you trying to make yourself attractive to a donor instead of saying, hold on a second, does this donor meet our standards? Do they have a passion for what we're doing? Do they represent the diversity of our client base? What can they bring to us in addition to their investments, no matter how modest they may be, in terms of insight, time, and evangelizing? So, and as we already know, if a funder stops funding you, it may be tough, if not impossible, to recover. But as much as we want to keep our donor retention as close to 100% or 95% year after year, you can sustain the loss of a few people who give you $100 or $500 a year, because they're easier to replace than the funders who give you a gazillion dollars a year. Oops. And I know we all talk about this all the time, but the fact is that most mega donors are the 1%, the titans of industry, the ultra wealthy, and they are mostly white people. They're usually highly educated too. So we're sort of, I don't know, I just get the feeling that this type of funding sort of turns nonprofits into a luxury item. Does that make sense, Kim or Brendan? We don't want to just get their engagement. And if we have widespread engagement in our donor base, then we're more resilient, we're more representative, and we can get more done. I think the nonprofit sector represents the hope of America's future, because we serve so many people and we can gain the generosity of so many people at so many levels to bring about meaningful social change. So when you have a broad funding base, you will become a more resilient and more sustainable organization, where no single funder outweighs other funders. It's easy to recover from funders who cease funding you. You have lots of potential to upgrade. And frankly, you have lots of potential to do stuff that major donors are not likely to do. Get involved in your events, volunteer at your centers, and make gifts in kind as well as other kinds of gifts. So let's talk about how we're going to create marcher-driven funding. Okay, folks, this is time for a little homework. You have to explore the data by analyzing your donor base. And Brendan, I want to pick on you and ask you to unmute yourself for a second.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you just talk a little bit about QGive's ability to create reports and provide analytics around exploring the data?
I can, absolutely, yeah. QGive has a suite of reporting tools that do allow for just what you're saying, the kind of deeper view of your donor information and the levels that they're giving at. Of course, a huge component of our offering is being able to also integrate with the other tools that you're using to do those same things. So we integrate with our great partners at Bloomerang and Donor Perfect, as well as many other CRMs that are commonly used in the space. But for that very purpose, as you're collecting this information, it's incredibly important to get it back into those tools that you use to make the decisions on your programming, on your next really targeting and prospecting when it comes to major gifts.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
One of the things you want to know is where are you today? You can't really improve any funding or outreach strategy unless you know where you are today. So you start with an exploration of current data. And among other things, you want to know, is our income overly concentrated in one funder or one type of funders? For example, we are currently working with a major federally qualified health center that serves 100,000 patients a year. And their major funder is the federal government. And the federal government has been tapping them on the shoulder for some time now, saying, we love you to death, you do great work, but we really need to see you start to raise money from individuals to complement federal funding. And it's been a real tough row for them to hoe, because it's difficult for them to think outside the box of meeting federal grant requirements. So they're in this uncomfortable space right now where they're over concentrated in in one type of major investment. The next thing you have to ask is, what are your outreach strategies? How are you connecting with the world of the marchers? And one of the things I just adore about QGive is its support for what Brendan has described, but also what Kim mentioned earlier. Every type of peer-to-peer online event, auction, I don't know, hiring a blimp to fly over your gala, whatever it takes to get you known, and all the social giving opportunities you have. You also want to make sure that your messaging and your collateral and your website is looking to support people like your clients. And figuring out, down here in South Florida, we always want to see our clients have a lot of Hispanic surnames, because South Florida, that's Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and Palm Beach, all three of those counties are becoming majority minority. So if we only have donor bases that support Smiths and Funks and Bristols and no Garcias and so on, something's wrong. You also want to know whether your number of funders, not just the amount of money you get, but is your number of funders or donors growing or shrinking, or is it static? If it's shrinking, you got to do something. If it's static, you got to do something. If it's growing, yay for you, lock in what's working and make sure you can, crank up the acquisition meter a little bit more all the time, while you're also cranking up the retention meter. Another thing you want to know is there age diversity in your funding base? Lots of old school, large nonprofits are recognizing that they're in a pickle because the majority of their funders are either in their 80s and they're the World War II generation, or they're older baby boomers. I personally kind of fall in between those two age cohorts, because it's great. Those are the people who are looking to think about planned giving, making legacy gifts to you, and so on and so forth. But we're noticing that, what do we call the generation after the millennials? I think we call them Gen Z. Is that right? So millennials, who are now in their 25 to 40, and Gen Z, who are in high school and college, these people are very outward directed. They're very philanthropic. There are a lot of activists in that younger crowd. And those are the people you want to be giving their modest amount of money, but working on your behalf, making your organization relevant, by volunteering, by giving of their time, by running peer funding strategies or car wash drives or whatever it is. So you really want to broaden the funding base, because in order to fulfill this notion of having funders represent the ownership of your nonprofit, which is, as we said earlier, the community you serve owns you, especially if you're in a human services organization, but frankly, in other types of organization as well. So the kinds of programs and funding strategies you can deploy with great efficiency and effectiveness through QGIve, or like platforms, excuse me, for mentioning that there might be some competition there. The great thing about today's communication technology is that one message can reach millions of people. And an effective message may not generate an investment right that minute, although if you learn how to message it properly, it often does. But it improves the awareness of your mission, your cause, your programs. And it's accessible to those who may have passion, but limited means or no means. I often like to think about, you know, if you listen to public radio, after a while, you kind of get annoyed because they're always running pledge drives, right? But they always also remind us, you can make a $5 gift a month and it makes a big difference. So you've got to think of all the ways that you can make the value of your organization visible to people who are right to become your marchers. Let me elaborate on that just a little bit. They're right to become your marchers because their motivations, their passion, and their interest are what are going to make them good candidates for supporting you financially or through other means. When you talk about major gifts, those major funders also have to have similar motivations, but we also spend a lot of time asking ourselves whether or not they have the giving capacity that a major gift campaign or major investment campaign would require. So we have to remember that you should be setting funder concentration limits in your organization. Use the reporting tools that Brendan mentioned. If you're not using QGIve, figure out other ways you can determine how many people, how many funding sources represent how much, why am I getting tongue-tied? Whether or not you have an over concentration in a single funder or a group of funders. And by the way, I'm using the term funders to include donors, grant makers, and corporate sponsors, okay? Now, you guys have the right to set limits. I like to call these performance expectations. So in your organization, even if it is an all volunteer shop with all volunteer fundraising teams, get together and agree on what is the limit we want to set for a single funder or a single group of funders. Is it 45% where it used to be 60%? Is it 32% where it used to be 40%? Whatever it is, define what you want to maintain. And for major funders, keep in mind the cycle of aging out. This goes beyond the older donor base, the people who die and don't leave you any of their money. It also includes grants and corporate sponsorships that may be time limited and that have to be, excuse me, that have to be replaced. Give me a second. I like to think of this concept of the marchers as being a renewable resource. In my field, fundraising consulting, we tend to see a lot of differentiation among our clients about, are we running an acquisition campaign or are we running a retention campaign and all that sort of stuff. In my opinion, every nonprofit needs to operate a little bit more like a sales team, where in my selling days, and I know in QGIV's team's selling days, we're always looking to acquire new opportunities. In this case, the marchers are what we refer to as those transactional investors, the ones who will give you a modest gift right on Facebook, just because your message was so impactful. At the same time, you're constantly working to retain as many of those smaller investors as you possibly can, and also aiming your outreach strategies to encourage those who have given at a modest level for several years a gentle request to see if they can increase the size of their gifts. And if not, you've got to be diplomatic enough not to yell at them, scold them, or make them feel they're otherwise not important. So this means it's really important to invest in effective messaging. And offer and create other opportunities for engagement in addition to donations. So let's talk about effective messaging for a moment. I'm going to just peek ahead because I can't remember I said something about this. No, I didn't. So I'll say it here. The best way to know what should go into your search engine optimization, your website content, your blogs, your social media posts, and all the ways that you shout out to the world, we're here, is to talk to current donors and grant makers and corporate sponsors. And you ask them a few questions. And I'm really sorry I didn't include this stuff in this deck. But one of the resources Kim has available for you is access to our Smart Practices resource library, easy for me to say, and a critical download for you is 3 simple questions that get donors to give. So let me talk about this for a minute. The kinds of what I want to encourage you to do is, whenever you can, speak to a volunteer, a donor, or a major donor, or any other kind of funder. Send an email saying, dear fill in the blank name, would you do me a favor? We're working on our marketing, or we're trying something new and I'd like to get your feedback on it. Now, you have to make clear this is not a request for money or a disguised request for money. And then you say, you know, I don't know you, and I really need to know you. I need to know what made you decide investing in our nonprofit was a good idea. Do you come from a tradition where your family or your faith has always contributed to giving? Have you had experiences like, you know, what's your life been like? What is it that makes our work resonate with you? You feverishly take a lot of notes on what they say. And then you ask yourself, does our web content, our email marketing, or our social marketing, or any other marketing we do, reflect what our favorite donors told us? You know, I really like what you're doing because my Aunt Tilly suffered so badly from the heartbreak of psoriasis or dandruff. And I don't want to see other people having to go through what she went through. That's the great kind of statement you want to hear, as silly as it may sound, but it really, really works. So talk to your donors. God willing, the next time you have an actual live event, including a thon, march, walk, run, ride, dance, make sure you have those conversations with people that you're around. And if you encourage your people to do peer-to-peer fundraising, ask them to ask some of those same questions. While you are doing this kind of work, pay attention to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. what we've discovered, and there's some very interesting research on this, is that boards that include people of racial and social differences will perform better than boards that are, cookie cutter all the same. And when you have Black, Indigenous, and people of color as your funders and on your team as fundraisers, there's lots of those people out there. They're underrepresented in both funding circles and the fundraising profession. Take advantage of them. Most such people want to be recognized for most people want to be recognized, period, the end, for their contribution to society in some way, shape, or form, even if it doesn't look like it. And the purpose of this is to raise your nonprofit from a little pathetic nothingness begging for crumbs to a true community asset. I don't mean to insult anybody, and you'll probably all yell at me later, and it won't be the first time. But lots of organizations in my 26 years of working with nonprofits kind of present themselves as with their hand out, or with the sign saying homeless and hungry that you see when you exit the highway. You don't want your nonprofit to be perceived as needy and miserable. You want your nonprofit to become a community asset. Get to know your community and seek people who can be involved and give you those differing perspectives and insights. So talk to your funders at all giving levels. One of the things that happens when you start talking to your funders is that you discover that your perspectives are very different from what you think they believe. So that's why you really have to get that conversation going. And frankly, if your organization is small to mid-size, you might not have the manpower to do it. So you can engage some of your funders in volunteering and spreading the word about you, speaking on your behalf at Rotary clubs, posting on your behalf, all kinds of things that they can do. Just open your mind to all the ways we can communicate with each other now that simply weren't available 20 years ago, and in some cases 10 years ago. And then leverage the right software. QGIve is one of my favorites, maybe my all-time favorite in this field, because we do a lot of work together. And you want to have technology that supports strategies for low-dollar investments, such as annual giving, peer-to-peer fundraising, special events, online giving, text to give, and social giving, and the powerful kinds of reporting tools that Brendan mentioned. And now it's time for questions. And somewhere in here, Kim has contact information from me. What I want to say is we only have about 10 minutes left. And if your question doesn't get answered, please email me, ellen@bristolstrategygroup.com, and I promise to reply.
Well, thank you, Ellen. And yes, this is the question time. So if there are anyone that want to put any questions in there, Beth, I see you're raising your hand. Do you mind putting your question in the Q&A? and then we can kind of get to that. I did have a few questions that were submitted before the webinar, so I'll go to one of those while hopefully we see if Beth can drop her question in. So
Right.
Ellen, we haven't been able to hold our big event since COVID. We've lost money. What should we do to improve our situation?
Okay. This is really interesting. What we've discovered is that one of the reasons nonprofits earned a lot more money based on that Giving USA report was because so many of them were capable of pivoting to a virtual environment. So if you haven't been able to hold a traditional gala or county fair or circus day or barbecue lunch, now's a good time, since we're seeing a resurgence of infections, to try a virtual event. Virtual events can be conferences, they can be webinar series, they can be meet our clients ideas. You could invite, just set aside an hour to 90 minutes once or twice a quarter and say, come and learn more about what we're doing. I think of this as the virtual tour. And you can also invite speakers who are experts in the work you do. So the concept of a virtual conference delivered in small chunks, or just calling it, I don't care what you call it, it's basically a webinar like what we're doing, is a good way to re-engage your donors. You don't have to charge for the program, although you can, since people are accustomed to paying for a ticket to attend certain kinds of events, especially like gala events. So just consider repurposing the gala to something virtual, which saves you a lot of money because you're not paying for venue or catering. And most of the speakers you would want to present will do it for you for nothing. I hope that's helpful.
Well, it sounded good to me. And I want to point out that in the follow-up email, we will have some links to a couple things. But, if you haven't taken advantage of the QGIve Resource Center, we have got so many great examples on virtual and hybrid events, particularly. So that might inspire some folks. Another question here, to kind of jump into recurring giving.
Yeah.
We seem to be able to get new donors every year, but we can't retain them. They just won't give the next year. What are we doing wrong?
Yeah, I think that there are two things we are doing wrong as an entire sector. AFP has been running the Fundraising Effectiveness Project since 2006, which is 15 years of data. And guess what comes up year after year after year after year? Retention rates really are terrible. In a good year, they're around 40%. So the question in my mind is not what we are doing, but what aren't we doing? Do we know what motivates donors to give? In most instances, the answer is no, we don't. We think we do, and we can use prospect research services if we're looking for larger gifts to see who gives a lot of money. But we need to do two things. We need to say, you know what? We're going to set a performance target. We're all going to agree that we're going to raise our retention level from X to Y in the next year. And we're going to sit around and we're going to have conversations with donors and with each other and maybe a couple of willing consultants to figure out different ways to convey our message. The least effective way to raise money is to call your friends and say, I'm real involved and you need to give too, or I'm going to lose goodness points. Another really lousy way to raise money is say, hi, I'm with the Institute for the Bewildered and I need you to give us $25 right now. Why? And who the heck do you think you are? So you need to find out by talking to people, talking to strangers, what really motivates them, what matters to them, and keep tweaking and tweaking and tweaking your messaging so that you start to see more retention happening. Once you tweak your messaging, your team and your peer fundraising strategies in particular, everybody on the fundraising team, whether they're volunteers, staff, fancy schmancy major gift officers or not, they have to understand the giving motivations of the donors who are most likely to be retained for the long term. That's when you understand that and everybody else understands it, your retention rates will begin to climb. And I assure you, it's not easy and it's gonna be painful, but it's a lot less painful than if you just let it happen.
Well, that makes sense to me. But I'm an easy one to convince, I guess. Well, Ellen, we're coming up on time, and so I
Did
think
we ever answer?
Oh, you know what? Beth said that she pushed the wrong button, so we're fine. You answered the other questions that we'd had. So
Okay,
I just
great.
wanted to again thank you for sharing all this great information with us today, and those of you that are watching, thank you for joining. We are again going to email a copy of this recording and the presentation, plus links to some great resources like Ellen mentioned, her resource page, a benchmarking study that was done also on the leaky bucket assessment. I will make sure, it looks like there's some good QGIve resources that need to be in there, like our generational giving report and our new big book of virtual and hybrid events. So we'll make sure you have links to those, because I think that'll help you with your fundraising planning. So if you would like to reach out to the QGIve team or Ellen, Ellen, yes.
Yeah, I want to make 2 comments. Even though my phone number is on here, I'm the world's worst person at answering the phone if I don't know who's calling.
So email you?
The best way to reach me is by email or a LinkedIn message. The other thing I want to mention is I'd really like to encourage you guys to take the Leaky Bucket Assessment for Effective Fundraising in its current form, because we currently have about 1,500 assessments in that data set. We want to really pack it before we evolve to the new and improved version, where our 2 companies are going to be in partnership, and that's going to be a very exciting new version. The Leaky Bucket is the only popular study identifying the drivers of productivity in a fundraising department and comparing your assessing the level of maturity of those practices in your organization. We find out where your fundraising bucket is leaking.
Well, it's fabulous, and I'm sending a link to everyone who's watching and everyone who registered. And then I just want to remind everyone to please complete the survey. And we really hope that all the information we covered today really helps you understand the importance of diversifying your funding. Thank you again, Ellen. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And we will be in touch. You have a great day and happy fundraising.
Thank you, Ellen, so much. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.